There is a man who has said his affirmations every morning for 11 months. He stands in front of the mirror before the world has fully woken up, and he says the words with conviction. I am worthy of love, I am financially abundant, I am chosen. He has not missed a day. He has visualized the relationship, journaled the numbers in his bank account as if they were already true, repeated the phrase in the shower, in the car, in the 4 minutes before sleep that Neville Goddard himself called the most important moments of the day. And then he checks his phone. The match doesn't message back. The deposit doesn't come. The same shape of rejection finds him again, wearing a different face, in a different city, with a different name attached to it. He does not conclude that the law is false. He concludes that he is doing it wrong, that he needs a better affirmation, a longer visualization, more repetitions, more feeling. So he adds more, and reality, with the same precision it has shown all year, reflects the same result back to him. This is not a failure of effort. It is a failure of variable selection. He has been optimizing the signal he can hear, while a second, louder signal runs underneath it, completely unmonitored. And the second signal is the one actually being received. What I am describing is not a problem of belief. It is not a problem of frequency in the vague sense that word gets used. It is a structural problem, and it has a name, and the name comes from 3 independent sources that were never in conversation with each other. A Swiss psychiatrist working in the first half of the 20th century, a Harvard social psychologist running a laboratory experiment on thought suppression in 1987, and a mystic standing on stages in Los Angeles and New York, describing with total conviction a law he insisted was as exact as gravity. 3 different vocabularies, 3 different eras, the same mechanism, described from 3 independent angles. That convergence is the entire subject of what follows. Start with the part you already half understand, because you have to understand it correctly before you can see what's missing from it. Neville Goddard's central claim, stated across decades of lectures, most precisely in his 1944 book, Feeling is the Secret, is that imagination is not decoration. It is not a visualization technique in the sense your average self-help book means it. Goddard's claim is mechanistic, that the feeling of a wish fulfilled, assumed with enough sensory specificity and held in a state he called the state akin to sleep, a relaxed hypnagogic state where critical faculty is lowered and the subconscious accepts suggestion without resistance, gets impressed into what he termed the subconscious. And the subconscious then operates as a kind of executive function, organizing circumstance, timing, and event to correspond to the assumption that has been impressed upon it. He was explicit that this was not metaphorical. In his 1948 lecture, The Law and the Promise, he stated plainly that imagining creates reality, and that the world you experience is simply the structure of your own assumption, externalized and returned to you as fact. The world is yourself, pushed out. The mechanism Goddard described, stripped of its mystical packaging, maps with uncomfortable precision onto something modern cognitive science independently arrived at: predictive processing. Carl Friston's framework, developed across the 2000s and 2010s at University College London, proposes that the brain does not passively receive sensory data and then interpret it. The brain generates a prediction first, a model of what it expects reality to be, and then uses incoming sensory data primarily to correct or confirm that prediction, weighting confirming data more heavily than disconfirming data whenever the prediction is held with high confidence. Whether Goddard understood the mechanism in these terms is irrelevant. The structure he described in 1948 and the structure Friston formalized 60 years later are, functionally, the same structure. An assumption, held with enough conviction, repeated with enough specificity, becomes the model the nervous system uses to filter, weight, and select incoming information. This is the surface variable. This is the part of the mechanism that every affirmation practice, every vision board, every gratitude journal is implicitly trying to operate on. Assume the end. Hold the feeling. Let the model update. And for a narrow category of goals, in a narrow category of people, this alone produces results, which is exactly why it gets taught as the entire system, and exactly why so many people, doing it correctly, by the book, still get nothing. Because there is a second mechanism operating underneath this one, and it does not announce itself, and almost nobody who teaches manifestation as inspiration rather than mechanism ever names it correctly. The assumption is not the only thing being held in the field. There is another assumption running simultaneously, older, more deeply encoded, and almost entirely outside conscious access. And when the two assumptions conflict, the older one wins. Not sometimes. Structurally. Every time. This is where Carl Jung enters, and he enters with a specific technical concept, not a vague gesture toward negative energy or blocks. Jung's concept of the shadow, developed across his career and articulated most fully in Ion, published in 1951, describes the shadow as the sum of everything the conscious personality has rejected, denied, or refused to integrate into its self-concept. Not evil, necessarily, simply unacceptable to the identity the person has constructed. A person who has built a self-concept around being financially responsible may have shadow material around greed, or around the shame of past financial failure that they have never metabolized, only suppressed. A person who has built a self-concept around being lovable and easygoing may have shadow material around rage, or around the belief, formed in childhood and never revised, that they are fundamentally unlovable beneath the performance. Jung's critical insight, the one that almost never makes it into popular manifestation content, is that the shadow does not disappear when it is denied. It does not get neutralized by being ignored. It goes underground, and from underground, it continues to operate. And because it operates outside conscious awareness, it operates without correction, without nuance, and without limit. The man affirming abundance every morning is not lying when he says the words. But if there is an unmetabolized shadow belief underneath the affirmation, I am the kind of person money leaves, I am fundamentally unworthy, I will be abandoned the way I was before, that belief is not competing with the affirmation on equal footing. It is older, it is more deeply encoded into the identity structure, and it has had decades of confirming evidence reinforcing it, while the affirmation has had 11 months. Now, I want you to think about what this means for suppression specifically, not just denial, but the active, effortful act of pushing something out of awareness, because suppression is not neutral. Suppression is not simply not thinking about it. Suppression is an active cognitive process, and in 1987, Daniel Wegner, then at Trinity University and later at Harvard, ran an experiment that demonstrated exactly what that process does. Wegner instructed subjects not to think about a white bear for 5 minutes, and to ring a bell every time the thought intruded anyway. What he found became one of the most replicated findings in cognitive psychology. Subjects instructed to suppress the thought experienced more intrusions of that exact thought than control subjects who were simply told to think about whatever they wanted, including a white bear. Wegner called this the ironic process. The deliberate effort to not think about something requires the mind to maintain a monitoring process that checks continuously whether the forbidden thought is present. That monitoring process is itself a representation of the thought. The mechanism designed to suppress the content keeps the content active. The harder the suppression, the louder the signal. This is the layer that every surface treatment of affirmation practice misses entirely. The man who has spent 11 months affirming, "I am worthy of love," has, in nearly every documented case of this pattern, also spent 11 months, and likely decades before that, actively not looking at the specific shadow content underneath the affirmation. He has not examined the rejection from his father. He has not examined the relationship where he was the one who caused harm and has never forgiven himself for it. He has not looked at the part of him that, on some level, believes love is conditional, and he has already failed the condition. He has not looked at it because looking at it is unbearable, and so instead, he has done the opposite. He has affirmed over it, louder, as if volume could substitute for integration. But Wegner's mechanism does not care about volume. It cares about monitoring. The shadow content he is suppressing requires active, continuous psychic energy to keep suppressed. Energy that, by the logic of ironic process theory, keeps that exact content structurally present and active in the system, even as the conscious mind is fixed entirely elsewhere, on the affirmation, on the vision board, on the feeling of the wish fulfilled. And here is where the system becomes precise, because now you can see the convergence directly. Goddard's mechanism says, the assumption held in the subconscious organizes the field. Jung's mechanism says the shadow is not eliminated by denial. It persists, underground, fully active. Wegener's mechanism says the act of suppression does not quiet the suppressed content. It amplifies its activation through continuous unconscious monitoring. Put these three together, and you arrive at a precise, mechanistic answer to the curiosity gap every chronic affirmation practitioner is stuck inside. The part of the self that is being denied does not go silent. It becomes, by the very mechanics of suppression, the strongest transmitter in the field, not despite the effort to bury it, because of the effort to bury it. The energy spent keeping the shadow material out of awareness is the same energy that keeps it structurally active as an operating assumption. And an active assumption, by Goddard's own framework, organizes experience around itself regardless of whether the person holding it wants it to. This is not a feeling, not a mood, a transmitter. The affirmation is conscious, deliberate, and weak, in the specific sense that it has not had time to become structurally encoded into identity. The shadow assumption is unconscious, automatic, and strong, because it has often been running since childhood, reinforced by years of confirming experience, and now additionally amplified by the very act of suppression deployed against it. Two assumptions, occupying the same field, at radically different strengths. The field does not average them. It does not negotiate. It organizes around the dominant one, not the world, the identity. Always the identity. Now, the calibration, because these mechanisms sit at different levels of certainty, and it would be dishonest to present them as equivalent. Wegener's ironic process theory is a well-replicated empirical finding within cognitive psychology. The white bear paradigm has been reproduced across dozens of studies with consistent effect sizes for suppressed thought rebound. It is not a metaphysical claim. It is a documented feature of how attention and suppression interact. Jung's concept of the shadow is not an empirical finding in the same sense. It emerged from clinical observation across decades of Jung's own analytic practice and has since been adopted, in varying forms, across psychodynamic therapy. It is a clinically useful and widely corroborated model, not a measured physical quantity. Goddard's claim that a held assumption organizes external circumstance, not merely perception of circumstance, but circumstance itself, is the most metaphysically ambitious of the three, and it sits outside what empirical psychology can currently test directly. What predictive processing can confirm is that assumption organizes perception and filters attention with extraordinary power. Whether it organizes the external event itself, in the stronger sense Goddard meant, is a claim that exceeds current measurement. The honest position is this: the psychological mechanism, suppressed shadow content dominating perception, attention, and behavior, is well supported and sufficient on its own to explain why the man's reality keeps reflecting the same rejection. Goddard's stronger metaphysical claim may be true as well. The mechanism does not require you to resolve that question to be useful. It requires you to notice that the shadow assumption, whatever its ultimate causal reach, is the one actually running the field. There is a third psychological mechanism that sits alongside Jung and Wegener, and it explains why the suppressed shadow content does not just persist passively, but actively organizes behavior in ways the conscious mind never authorized. Robert Cialdini, working out of Arizona State University, documented identity consistency as one of the most powerful, under-acknowledged drivers of human behavior, the tendency of a person to act in alignment with a self-concept, stated or implied, even when that alignment runs directly against their stated interest. Cialdini's research, built across decades of work on commitment and consistency, demonstrated that once a person has an identity, even an identity formed unconsciously, even one they would explicitly deny holding, behavior reorganizes itself to remain consistent with that identity, often invisibly, often through choices that look situational, but are in fact identity confirming. This matters here because the shadow is not simply a passive reservoir of denied content. It is functionally a competing identity, a self-concept the person has never consciously claimed, but has nonetheless been organizing decades of behavior around. The man who believes, underneath the affirmation, that he is the kind of person money leaves is not merely hosting an unpleasant belief. He is, by Cialdini's mechanism, unconsciously behaving in ways that keep his financial behavior consistent with that identity. turning down the opportunity that felt slightly too easy, hesitating at the negotiation, underpricing the offer, missing the deadline that would have closed the deal. None of this requires conscious sabotage. It only requires an identity, suppressed but intact, exerting the same consistency pressure Cialdini documented in subjects who had no awareness of the mechanism shaping their choices. Carl Rogers, working from a very different clinical tradition, arrived at a closely related finding that psychological distress correlates most strongly not with difficult circumstances themselves, but with incongruence, the gap between the self-concept a person consciously holds and the actual, lived experience of who they are, including the parts they have not integrated. Rogers' framework, developed through decades of client-centered therapy beginning in the 1940s and 50s, treated this incongruence as the central variable in psychological function, more predictive than any single life event. Applied here, the gap between the conscious affirmation, "I am worthy, I am abundant," and the suppressed shadow identity beneath it is not a minor inconsistency. It is, in Rogers' terms, the precise condition under which a person becomes least able to perceive their circumstances accurately, because perception itself becomes organized around defending the gap rather than closing it. There is a parallel structure in Hermetic tradition that predates all three of these vocabularies by centuries, and it is worth naming precisely rather than gesturing at vaguely, because precision is the entire discipline this channel insists on. The Hermetic principle of correspondence, articulated in the Kybalion in 1908 as a codification of older Hermetic teaching traced to the Corpus Hermeticum, states, "As above, so below, as within, so without." Modern manifestation culture turned this into a decorative phrase. The Hermetic initiates who encoded it meant something operational. They meant that inner structure is not loosely correlated with outer structure. It is causally upstream of it, mirrored with precision, not sentiment. If the inner structure includes a conscious assumption and an unconscious, suppressed counter-assumption, Hermetic logic would predict that the below, the externalized world, mirrors not the louder, conscious layer, but the deeper, more structurally dominant one. This is the same prediction Jung's clinical model makes, and the same prediction predictive processing makes when you account for prediction confidence rather than prediction volume. Three frameworks, separated by centuries and methodology, converging on the same operational claim. What governs the mirror is not what you say. It is what is structurally true about your identity, including, especially, the part you have refused to look at. Kabbalistic structure encodes the same architecture with even more specificity. In the Sephirot, the 10 emanations mapped on the Tree of Life, Yesod, the 9th sphere, is described as the foundation, the direct interface between the inner world and outer manifested form. Everything held in the higher spheres, conscious and unconscious alike, passes through Yesod before it becomes Malkuth, the 10th sphere, the physical externalized world. What modern manifestation teaching loosely calls the subconscious maps, with striking precision onto this structure. Not a vague inner repository, but a specific functional layer whose job is to take whatever is held above it, including what has been pushed down out of conscious view, and translate it into form. Kabbalistic tradition does not describe Yesod as selective about which content it passes through. It passes through what is there. A consciously held affirmation and an unconsciously suppressed shadow assumption both sit in the layers above Yesod, and both, by this structure, are eligible to be translated into Malkuth. The tradition does not predict that the louder content wins. It predicts that whatever is structurally present passes through, which is, again, the same prediction Jung's clinical model makes and the same prediction Cialdini's consistency research makes, arrived at through an entirely different methodology centuries earlier. Think about what this means for the woman who leaves a relationship because her partner is emotionally unavailable, moves to a new city, builds a new life, meets someone new, and within 14 months is describing the same dynamic and language nearly identical to what she used before. The circumstances are different. The person is different. The pattern is not. This is not bad luck. It is not, as the surface-level manifestation content would frame it, attracting what you fear. It is a perceptual filter organized around an unrevised shadow assumption about her own worth or her own safety and intimacy, selecting for confirming evidence so efficiently that she experiences the selection as discovery rather than construction. She believes she is finding the same kind of partner again. What she is actually doing is filtering attention, interpretation, and behavioral response through an identity structure that has never been revised, only suppressed, affirmed over, and left to run on default. Goddard had a specific technical term for the corrective action, and it is worth naming precisely because it is the part of his system most people skip entirely in favor of the easier practice of affirmation. He called it revision, the deliberate, imaginative reconstruction of a past event, replayed in the state akin to sleep, not as it happened, but as it should have happened, with enough sensory specificity that the nervous system registers the revised version as real. Revision is not affirmation. Affirmation operates on the future. It states what is desired as already true. Revision operates on the past. It goes directly into the structure where the original wound, the original shadow content, was encoded and reconstructs it. This is the part of the mechanism that most affirmation practice skips, and it is precisely the part that would address the shadow content directly instead of suppressing it further. Goddard, in lectures throughout the 1950s, treated revision as more powerful than affirmation precisely because it operates on the encoded assumption itself, rather than attempting to layer a new, weaker assumption on top of an unaddressed one. The distinction matters mechanically, not just rhetorically. An affirmation is forward-facing. It asserts a desired state that has no existing structural foundation in the person's encoded identity, which is exactly why it requires so much repetition to take hold at all, and why it remains so vulnerable to being overridden by older, better encoded material. Revision is backward-facing in its target, but forward-facing in its function. It does not invent a new assumption from nothing. It goes to the specific memory where the shadow content was originally encoded, the moment of rejection, the specific sentence a parent said, the specific failure that calcified into identity, and replays that scene in the same relaxed hypnagogic state Goddard prescribed for affirmation, but with the outcome reconstructed, not fantasized vaguely. Reconstructed with the same sensory specificity Goddard demanded of every state akin to sleep. The tone of voice, the physical sensation, the precise words exchanged, revised. The nervous system, by the logic of memory reconsolidation research developed decades after Goddard's death, most notably the work on reconsolidation windows that opens briefly each time a memory is recalled, does not perfectly distinguish a vividly reconsolidated memory from the original encoding. Each time the original memory is recalled, and the brain has a narrow window in which to either restabilize it as is or update it with new information. Revision exploits exactly that window. This is not Goddard's language, but it is functionally what he was describing decades before the neuroscience existed to name the window he was using. This also reframes what shadow integration actually requires in operational terms rather than therapeutic vagueness. Integration, in Jung's framework, does not mean indulging the shadow content or acting it out. It means consciously acknowledging that the content exists as part of the self, examining it without the defensive suppression that keeps it structurally amplified, and, critically, removing the energy that suppression was consuming to keep it hidden. The moment the man stops expending psychic energy on, not looking at the belief that he is unlovable, two things happen simultaneously. First, by Wegener's mechanism, the ironic monitoring process that was keeping the thought structurally active begins to relax. The rebound effect requires active suppression to maintain itself, and removing the suppression removes the amplification. Second, by Goddard's mechanism, the field is now open for a single, conscious, examined assumption to operate without an unconscious counter-assumption running beneath it at higher structural strength. The affirmation does not need to get louder. It needs to stop competing with a suppressed signal that has been winning by default for years. This is also why so much manifestation content fails its audience without ever being technically wrong. Telling someone to raise their vibration is not false in the sense that emotional and physiological state does influence perception, behavior, and even the kind of opportunities a person notices and acts on. Predictive processing supports that much directly. But the instruction is operationally empty if it does not name what is structurally suppressing the state in the first place. You cannot raise a vibration that is being actively, unconsciously pulled down by a shadow assumption you have never examined, using the same energy that's required to keep that assumption out of view. It is like being told to drive faster while your foot is also on the brake, and being given no information about the brake at all. The convergence is the entire point, and it deserves to be stated as precisely as the rest of this mechanism has been. Jung names the shadow and explains why denial does not eliminate it. Wegener demonstrates in a controlled laboratory setting exactly how suppression amplifies the very content it is trying to extinguish. Cialdini demonstrates that whatever identity is structurally present, suppressed or not, exerts a consistency pressure on behavior independent of conscious endorsement. Goddard names the operating principle by which whatever assumption is structurally dominant, not the loudest, the most structurally dominant, organizes the field of experience around itself. None of these four ever cited each other. None of them were working from the same tradition, the same era, or the same epistemic standard. Two were empirical psychologists working in laboratories. One was a clinical psychiatrist working from decades of analytic observation. One was a mystic who claimed no scientific method at all, and would likely have dismissed the question of empirical validation as beside the point. And they describe, independently, the same architecture. What you deny does not leave. It goes underground, gets amplified by the act of denial itself, gets reinforced by years of identity-consistent behavior the conscious mind never authorized, and becomes the operating assumption the field reflects back, wearing the disguise of bad luck, of timing, of the universe testing you, when it is in fact the most precise and consistent system imaginable, doing exactly what it has always done. Reflecting the identity, not the wish. It is worth being honest about what is settled and what is not, one final time, because the calibration is part of the discipline, not an afterthought to it. The behavioral consistency Cialdini documented and the suppression rebound Wegener documented are both well-replicated empirical findings. They do not require belief, only attention. Jung's shadow concept is a robust, clinically corroborated model rather than a measured quantity, and it has shaped psychodynamic practice for nearly a century, precisely because it keeps proving useful in the consulting room, even where it resists laboratory measurement. Goddard's claim that a dominant assumption reorganizes external circumstance itself, not merely the perception of circumstance, remains the most ambitious of the four and the hardest to test directly. What can be said with confidence is this: the psychological mechanism alone, a suppressed, identity-consistent shadow assumption dominating attention, perception, and unconscious behavior, is sufficient on its own terms to fully explain why the man's reality keeps reflecting the same rejection, without requiring any metaphysical claim beyond what cognitive science has already independently confirmed. Goddard's stronger claim may also be true. The mechanism does not ask you to resolve that question before it becomes useful to you. It only asks you to notice which assumption, conscious or shadow, has actually been winning. The man in front of the mirror is not failing the law. He is not unlucky, and he is not doing the words wrong. He has been running two assumptions in the same field, one conscious, recent, and deliberately constructed, one unconscious, old, structurally amplified by the precise effort he has spent trying not to look at it, and continuously reinforced by years of identity-consistent behavior he never consciously authorized. And the field, with total consistency, has been reflecting the dominant one. The mechanism does not require his belief in the affirmation to weaken. It requires him to stop suppressing the counter-signal underneath it, examine the shadow content directly, and, where Goddard's system offers the precise tool for it, revise the original assumption at the level where it was encoded, rather than affirming over it from a level it was never operating at. Change the shadow assumption with sufficient depth and the suppression ends. End the suppression and the amplification ends. End the amplification, and there is, for the first time, only one assumption running in the field. And the field, with the same precision it has always shown, reflects that one back. The assumption was already running. It was running before the affirmation began, and it will keep running after the affirmation ends, unless it is found and revised directly. The only operative variable was never the words in the mirror. It was the part of the self being denied, the part doing all the work, in the dark, the entire time.